This is a tutorial that will show you how to take complex photogrammetry meshes and convert them into simplified meshes that are suitable for mobile presentation. So here we have a photogrammetry mesh that is highly complex and has a high-res texture map applied to it. So if I show you the mesh that's underlying it, you can see it's quite complex. There's a lot of polygons, there's a lot of vertices, and they all move in a very haphazard kind of way. So in this tutorial, we'll be using free software that you can download online. We're going to use Blender and we're going to use instant meshes. So what I'll do is I'll load up instant meshes, and this is the interface you'll see when we work with instant meshes. So if I click Open Mesh and select the open, you will need an OBJ file. Now most photogrammetry solutions will output OBJ, so I'm just assuming you've already got that format. So if I click this file and I click open, it'll take a little while, but it will open up the mesh that you just saw from 3D Studio Max. Okay, so here is the mesh opened up. And what we're going to do is we're going to follow their process and simplify it. And it's really just a point and click thing. So make sure that you have quads selected, quads 4x4, that's what we want. You can choose your vertex count. So this I think had about 500,000 vertices, and I'm choosing to cut it down to 25,000. Now you can make that whatever you want by scrolling this, but I'm sticking with 25,000. So the first thing we do is just click solve in the orientation field. And the software will work its magic and we get these wacky lines. And for the purposes of this, we're going to keep it at point and click. There's a whole bunch of things you can do, but we're going to just ignore that and move down to position field. And we're going to click solve. And as it works, you can see that what it's doing is it's creating a projection of a quad mesh, a simplified quad mesh onto what was the original complex system. And I'm going to go and I'm going to click export mesh. And from there, I'm going to extract the mesh. And so now you can see we've got the end result, which is a much simplified mesh with far fewer polygons and is in a much better shape to be used on the less powerful mobile devices. And I'll save that out. I'll call it cave quad.obj. Now with this, you must have the OBJ. If you try to save it without, occasionally it'll fail. So you need to make sure that you have .obj in the system. So we click save, and now we have an outputted mesh. And we're going to move on to Blender next. So here I'm back in the Windows Explorer, and you can see the cavequad.obj that's been saved. And I'm just going to link to Blender and load that up. So in Blender, I'm going to choose an interaction style with 3D Studio Max. And the reason I'm doing that is when you work with Vortals, you'll find the interaction style is very similar to 3D Studio Max. So when you move into Blender with this interaction mode, it will be much easier for you to use. So I click out there and I'm going to delete this object here just by pressing delete and choosing delete OK. Now, all of what I'm about to show you is really just designed to be a point and click, follow exactly what I'm doing. You don't need to have any experience with Blender to understand what I'm doing, just follow exactly along with what I'm showing you. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File, Import, and I'm going to import an OBJ file. And I'm going to navigate to wherever it is that I had put the cave quad. And I'm going to click that and I'm going to import it. And so now you can see the file has loaded up. And when we were in the instant meshes system, what it did when it projected the simplified mesh is it got rid of all the UV data. Now UV data is designed to help you put textures onto your 3D model. This system has no UV data associated with it. So we now have to create that UV information. And the way to do that is to make sure you have Cave Quad selected. So you come up here and you click Cave Quad right here. And we move down into object mode. And you might find that this is somewhere else in your interface, but wherever object mode is in your interface, click it and go into edit mode. And so now you can see the mesh that we have just created. And I'm going to press U. It's a keyboard shortcut. Again, you don't have to think too much about the powers and whys of it, just press U. and then choose Smart UV Project, or Project, depending on how you want it. So ignore all of these and just press OK and let the system work it out. And it's now created the UV mesh. Now if you want to see that, what you can do is you can come to the top right hand corner and you can click there with your left mouse button and drag out a new interface. And down here on the bottom left of the new interface, you click that, you can reveal the UV image editor. And in here you can see the UV mapping that has been created automatically. Now there are a million ways that you can approach UV unwrapping an object, and this is probably not the best way of doing it, but for a simple point and click way, this is a great solution that gets you moving really quickly without having to think too much about what it is that you're trying to do. So the next thing that we have to do is we have to create a texture for this UV map. So we click New, and we create a new texture map. So I'm going to call it Cave Color New. And I'm going to make it 4096 by 4096. And I'm going to create it. Okay, so now we have a new map ready to be created. And so what we need to do is we need to take the information, the texture information from the original model that we saw in 3D Studio Max. We need to take that and we need to somehow put it onto this system. So Blender gives you a really wonderful way of doing that. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to import the original complex model into Blender. So I click Import OBJ, and I go to the Cave Original file, and I click it. Now, this is a very large file, so you may find that it takes your system a long time to load the original photogrammetry solution. So you can see the difference between the original and the new system we created from 89 meg down to 2.8 meg. Okay, so now I have loaded both meshes. And if I click back into object mode, you can see very clearly how the meshes have overlaid on top of each other. Now, this is a really important point. At no stage should you ever move these models around. You need to keep them exactly as they are. And what we're going to do now is we're going to select up here the original mesh, the high-res mesh. We're going to select that, and we're going to apply the original texture that we had from the photogrammetry solution. So if you come over here to Material, make sure that you have a material active. If not, then just click New Material over here. We're going to come down here to Shadeless. And for this particular case, we just want to make sure that it's shadeless, just so that we can see what's going on properly. Once we've clicked Shadeless, we come to here, which is the texture map. And we create a new texture map. And from there, we click Open. And we go back to our desktop or wherever it is that you have located the original color mapping. So I click Cave Color and I open it. And so now we have it in the texture system, and it has actually applied to the original model, but you might not see it, which might confuse you. So if you want to see the texture, we can come down to here to the right-hand side of object mode. There's this little thing here. We click that button and we click on Material. And once we do, we'll see that the texture has now been applied to the high-res model. So what we're actually trying to do here is we're going to take all the texture information from the high-res model and we're going to bake it into the new low-res model. And Blender gives us a really simple way of doing that. So I'm going to get you to click here, which is the render system, and make sure that you are on Blender Render. Blender gives you a number of different ways of doing this, but you want to make sure you're on Blender Render. And scroll down to Bake and open out the Bake dropout. And in there's another little pop-out called Full Render. You click that and choose Textures. And once you've chosen Textures, also click Selected to Active. So in here, Selected to Active. So what we're going to do is we're going to need to select the high res and then the low res. And what that's sort of suggesting is you're going to move the texture information from the high res model to the low res model. So what we do is in this navigator, we left click on this one, we press Shift, and then we click on the low-res model. Okay, so now we're ready to bake. And I click Bake, and Blender gets to work. So what we need to do with this data that's been created is save it out. So click Image, Save as Image. And again, navigate to wherever it is that you have the original, and I'm going to call it Cave Color New PNG and save image as. Okay, so this is now saved out. So we have one last step to achieve now that we have the mapping moved across. I'm going to hide the high-res model. So what we have with this low-res model is UV mapping that's now attached to a system that didn't have UV. So if you remember when we loaded the cave quad, there was no UV mapping associated with it. So it's important for us to save this file out so that when we load it into Vortals, we have the original OBJ file with UV mapping attached to it. So sometimes when you load files from Instant Mesh, or in fact from photogrammetry sites, you might find that the smoothing of the model is flat, like this. So make sure when you have this model selected and you're in object mode to choose smooth shading, which you find under Tools. Okay, so now we need to export this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the high-res model, which is currently hidden, and I'm going to unhide it. And I'm going to press Delete in the viewport, and I'm going to delete the high-res model. And now I'm going to go to File, I'm going to Export, and I'm going to export wavefront. So I'm only exporting the cave quad model. And again, I'm going to navigate to wherever it is that I've put the data, and I'm going to call this cave quad UV. So now I know that it's the quad system with UV mapping, and I'm going to export that. So now we're ready to use Vortals to load the system we've just created. So let's click New Vortals, let's create a new 3D slide, and let's load a 3D model. And let's load our cave quad UV. And it should load, yep, right here in the center point. So if I just scale it up, and move it back, you'll see now we have a much simplified mesh with the texture happily applied. And what I'll do is I will load another 3D model, which is the original cave, which is 89 megabytes versus the 2.8 megabyte file that I've just loaded. So obviously when I load that up, it'll take a lot longer to actually load into the system because it's a bigger file. So we might have to wait a little while as the system thinks to load such a heavy file. And there it is. So let me scale it up. And this has not had the texture applied, so I will now apply the original color image. So you can see the difference. Now, obviously the texture is, the quality of the model is far less than this one. There's much more detail in the original, but the point is this is ready for mobile, and there are a couple of things that you can do to make this kind of better high res if you want. So you could just simply choose to make the original mesh a little bit higher res. So I earlier created a higher res mesh, so this was 25,000, and I've created a 120,000 mesh versus a 500,000 mesh. So from right to left, this is a 600,000 polygon mesh, this is a 120,000 polygon mesh, and this is a 25,000 polygon mesh. So let me just texture this guy, and we can have a look at the difference now between, this is the super high res version, this is the medium high res version, and this is the super low res version. Now this 120,000 polygon one would be suitable for mobile devices. They would be able to handle that detail pretty well. But there is one other thing that you can do to preserve some of this detail, but it does require a little bit more thought behind how you approach some things. So when we were working originally, we were using textures. So we were baking the texture from the original model to the new model. But one of the things that you can do with the system is actually capture the distance between the new model and the original model. Distance in terms of the actual the mesh itself. And we can create what's called a normal map from that. So instead of a texture map that we're baking the distances via a texture. So down here on textures, I click textures and I change instead to a normal map. So if I click normal map, now again using exactly the same process that we did with the textures, and in fact on this, before I do that, I have created a new file, but you can simply overwrite the color file. Probably not a good idea, because if you forget to save the color file, you may lose that information. But so I've created a new file called HRUV. I select it here, and I press Shift, and I select the low res again, and I press Bake. And now I'm baking the normals rather than the texture information. Okay, and this is what normal information looks like. It's a very wacky file. It doesn't look like anything sensible. If you've never seen 3D data, this is a very strange looking file. However, this is very useful for use in gaming style systems where you can preserve an apparent detail without actually having to have the mesh in there. However, there are some drawbacks to this system. So let me save this as Caves Color Normals HR. So I will save that and go back to Vortals. So I'm going to load the normal system into here, and I can do that via texture options and normal map. And if I click on the normal map, I can apply it, and suddenly you'll see a lot of the original detail is apparently preserved into the texture data. However, this is a much more complex system, and you have to think a lot more carefully about exactly how it is that you're approaching your system. So when you look at this carefully, you will see a number of strange artifacts. And these artifacts are a consequence of the fact that I have not built my UV maps correctly. Using the very basic system, I can get away with that. So the process that I've showed you in this tutorial, you can create the texture maps very happily without any issue, and you can start working with simplified models very quickly. If you want to use normal maps, which will capture some more of the texture data and keep a lot of the detail that you might have wanted, you have to go back and think a bit more about your normal mapping. So if I go into Blender and show you what's happening, when you look at the UV maps that we've created, you'll see a lot of disconnections. You'll get points here that are separated. There's holes in the mesh, and they are mapped into the system, like it might be over here, this hole here might be over there, because it's a very computerized solution, and it's a non-continuous solution. So all of these bits are not one continuous mesh. The system gets confused when it tries to build this normal mapping system. There's a whole bunch of sort of complex reasons behind it, but what does happen when you apply it, and it's not one consistent UV map, is you get these strange artifacts. You need to have a UV mapping system that is complete. Now, that does require you to understand UV mapping. It needs you to understand how to change what this UV mapping looks like, and it's well beyond the scope of what I'm trying to show you now. I'm just making you aware that this is a thing that you can do to preserve detail. However, it is something that requires a lot more user knowledge in order to achieve a proper look. So this might have been quite quick, and you might need to go back over everything I've said a few times. The point of this tutorial is not to take you through the depths of Blender or the depths of image mesh. It's really just to show you a quick process to get from this high-res, mostly unusable at a mobile sense model, and how to slowly bring it down into something that can be used in a mobile system or a more advanced mobile system for this mid-range mesh.